Oh, okay. No, it's working. Okay, so let's talk about the behavioral revolution. If you have an interest in behavioral economics, if you have an interest in behavioral science, you know that behavioral science become very popular. Behavioral economics is a discipline which has become very popular. So if you Google behavioral economics, you want to know what it is, you will find these kind of statements. So if you're online, I think you should try to make sure. Oh my God, there's 95 participants, and I'm not sure how to. Is it? I think I saw it. I think it's good. Okay, so you will find these kind of statements. Behavioral economics states that humans are irrational and are incapable of making good decisions. That's often a kind of a shorthand description of the discipline. You will find behavioral economics relates psychology and economics to explore why people sometimes make irrational decisions and why and how the behavior does not follow the estimates of economic models.
You were unmuted. We want people to hear you.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
sorry.
Yeah.
Did you?
That's all right.
Did you organize to? Can they hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. Cool. All right. So when? Okay. So now I need to click on it. Sorry about this. Okay. When Richard Thaler got the Nobel Prize in 2017, this is how he was described by the magazine Slate. Richard Thaler wins economics Nobel for recognizing people are irrational. Okay. So this is a common way of presenting the discipline. And if you are even more interested and you want to know more about all these irrationalities, you will find this kind of list of cognitive biases. Okay, there's around 180 of them here. And if you can a magnifying glass, you'll find mental accounting, appeal to probability fallacy, normancy bias, etc. Plenty of those. So there is a complete menagerie of biases, of limitations, which really give a kind of a bleak picture about our ability to make good decisions. It looks like, we have difficulties handling uncertainty and probabilities. We have difficulties making decisions over time between the present and the future. We have difficulties understanding other people and understanding even how our beliefs and preference will change over time. So you have all these defects. And these visions here that you could have from this presentation of the discipline is that we are really riddled with biases and limitations. Now, having been in the discipline for quite a while, and I was a bit frustrated by this kind of way of presenting the discipline, because at the same time that we have found that we have all these patterns of behavior, it would be surprising if we were very, very bad at making decisions, didn't see you. If we were very bad at making decisions, in a way, it would be we were wondering, how did we make it here? How did our ancestors were successful enough to survive, thrive, have kids, get their kids to survive, etc. Right? And life out there can be very tough. So Richard Dawkins famously said that, if you're here, you should be, in a way, thankful that you are at the end of a long chain of winners in the tough history of evolution. So that would be surprising if we were really just riddled by imperfections. And so in this book, what I do is I go over the literature in bioeconomics, and I show that in many ways, lots of these biases have good reasons, have good explanations. There are solutions to the actual problems we face in real life. Okay. So I'm going today to talk about two domains and make these arguments to show that the way we behave are good solutions to the problems we face. And these insights that we can get them from biology, from progress in neuroscience, and even from economic theory by just rethinking about what are actually the problems that we're facing. And I'm going to present it under very broad categories, not in a kind of an academic way, but hopefully to make it more interesting and appealing. I'm going to talk about broad things that we're all familiar with. So I'm just going to start the first part of the talk with happiness. And the point here is going to say that the features of how happiness works, how our subjective satisfaction works, which sometimes can be peculiar, well, there are very good reasons behind this. So I'm going to start with a question to you. And I'm going to ask you to think about maybe 2 seconds to try to answer this question. How can we reach long-lasting happiness? What do you want to reach long-lasting happiness? And I think some of you, if you think about it, you may be thinking that this kind of thing is what, would make you reach long-lasting happiness, being rich, having great sporting car, doing some fancy thing on a yacht. And some others may have other views, finding a good mate, having friends, having just nice experiences. It's not maybe that there is one recipe for long-lasting happiness. Okay. So how can we reach long-lasting happiness? Well, the evidence from behavioral science is pretty clear, is that the answer is we can't. Okay. So whatever you were thinking from the pictures that would be the solution to the question, that's an illusion. The reason is, and it's not a new insight. You can read it in Hobbes in the Leviathan. Continual success in obtaining those things which a man from time to time desires, that is to say, continual prospering, is that man called felicity. For there is no such thing as perpetual tranquility of mind. While we live here because life itself is but motion and can never be without desire, nor without fear, no more than without sense. What Hobbes here is telling us is that there is no tranquility of mind. There is not a state where you will get this thing which will give you a perpetual happiness, and that will be it. No, when you reach there, you will want something else. You will desire something more. Okay? So you have this illusion that this great sporting car, this great yacht, this great dream job, or maybe this great partner is what you need, and you'll be happy forever after that. And that's what drives you to get this, but that's an illusion. And in modern behavioral science, this is known as the hedonic treadmill. Okay, so anybody have done a bit of psychology may be familiar with this. So happiness is like being on a treadmill, like this person here. And when you're on a treadmill, you try to move forward, you try to chase happiness, but you're never really getting ahead. And so happiness in this perspective works like that. That is, you have kind of an average level of happiness most of the time. And then sometimes some happy things happen, like you get your dream job, and you're happier than normal for some time, and then eventually it decreases, and you're back to this average level. And then sometimes you have bad things happening in your life, and then you get unhappy, but once again, eventually you habituate and you go back to this average point. Okay? And so happiness is something that we try to chase, but really what behavioral science tells us is that there's no way to get it forever. That's a bit frustrating. Why is it so? Why can't we have happiness? Well, let's look at why. Why can't we have happiness? And here we reach behavioral economics. Kahneman and Tversky, 1979, which is, depending on the year, I think, well, either the first or second highest paper quoted in economics, and they are psychologists. And this is a picture from their paper, which is trying to propose how does our subjective satisfaction work. And what Kahneman and Tversky tells us is that when we think about whether we're happy or not, we don't just look at what we have and that's it. We compare the whole stuff. We have to have a kind of a reference point, a benchmark, which we use to assess whether that's what we have is good or not. And so this reference point on this graph is at the 0 level, okay? And compared to this reference point, which we care about, if we have more, we think that we're successful relative to this benchmark. And if we have less, we think that we're unsuccessful, and so we think in terms of losses. And then our happiness, our subjective satisfaction is going to have this feature that, we get more happy if we are above the reference point. Though, if you look, you will see that this curve tends to decrease, so it becomes more, flatter over time. That is, if you were to win, I don't know, 100,000 pounds, you'd feel well. If you win another 100,000 pounds, you'd feel even better. But if you have already 3 million, the last 100,000 pounds would feel less important. And it's similarly, if you think in terms of losses, you would have the same thing in reverse. So if you start losing money, you'll feel very unhappy. But if you have already lost a lot of money, the additional same amount that you lose would feel not as much. And the other characteristic of this curve is that if you look carefully around 0, the slope is steeper in the losses. Okay? And the intuition here is that if you compare psychologically a gain of 100 pounds and a loss of 100 pounds, the loss feels worse. So that's called loss aversion. So we kind of experience losses as something more intense than the experience of a similar gain. This thing has been, people talk about the replication crisis in behavioral sciences. So this thing is very resilient to replication crisis. It's kind of very heavily supported by the available evidence. It's heavily used in economics, in psychology, etc. It's one of the big results of Kahneman-Tversky. Kahneman, who got the Nobel Prize in 2002, Tversky unfortunately died in 1996 before that time. Okay, so how is it presented? How is this fundamental result described in behavioral economics? Well, here's one recent paper, an economic paper. Reference-dependent preferences, which is this, because you have preferences over the outcome here, and it depends on a reference point. So reference-dependent preferences, theoretically and reasonably explain individuals' irrational behaviors when making decisions under uncertainty. So what Liu, Li, and Deng here tell us is that this is a mistake. It's a characteristic. It explains our mistakes, that we are imperfect. And if you Google, once again, what is loss aversion, well, you may get this kind of thing online. Loss aversion is a cognitive bias. Loss aversion is the fact that you have this slope here being steeper. It's a cognitive bias that describes why, for individuals, the pain of losing is psychologically twice as powerful as the pleasure of gaining. Okay, so here again, we have this presentation of behavioral economics as characterizing people as making mistakes, and this explains plenty of mistakes that we could make in our daily life. And what I'm going to argue now is that actually we have very good reasons behind, there's really good reasons behind having this kind of feature of our subjective satisfaction. And to start with, I'm going to ask a simple question. What is subjective satisfaction? Or maybe, what is it for? Why is it here? Why do we have this thing called subjective satisfaction? And it's a question we don't ask often because, we want to be happy, we think that this is going to make us happy, etc. But if you think, we take a step back and say, okay, why is there this thing? Why is it this thing that's subjective satisfaction? Why is it here in the first place? And there is a very simple answer to this. If you take an evolutionary point of view, and we've been, the process the result of an evolutionary process, well, there is a simple answer to what is subjective satisfaction, is that we have all the time to make decisions. Small decisions. You go to a cafe and we're asked, do you want a latte or a cappuccino? It sounds like a not important decision. Big decisions. Do you want to rent this place or do you want to look for another flat? Or do you want to say yes to this person proposing an engagement? Yes or no? Big decisions. Do you want to take this job in another city? Big decision. But we have to make decisions all the time. And to make decisions, we have to assess what is a good option, what is a better option. Okay? And so in this perspective, subjective satisfaction is just an index, a value, an assessed value of the quality of the different options we face. And you can think of this using this simplified representation, is that we need this kind of index to, at every moment, decide what is better and what is worse. And so subjective satisfaction is going to be lower for decisions which are bad for success, for survival and reproduction. So if you put your hand on a hot stove, that is bad. So you should feel bad. You should have the signal, that was not good, I didn't like that, I don't want to do it again. But for experiences which are good for, being healthy, successful, etc., like having lots of good energy in the morning, that you'd feel it's something good. And so satisfaction, an organism would have, you can think of satisfaction as a system which tries to track the value of the different options you face, just to lead you to make, every time you face decisions, to make the right decision, the better decision. It will be hard to make it, for this system to be perfect and to always orient you to the right decision, to the best decision, but that, you can think of it, that's the goal of this system. That's why this system exists in the first place. So now if we think of it, let's think a bit about what would be the features of such a system, if the system is to help you make decisions. And when we think like that, we can think about, okay, if we think what should the feature be, we can think that, well, it's likely there will be some constraint, because the system of satisfaction is produced by our brain, and our brain is composed of neurons, and there are it's not a supercomputer that you can access with unlimited ability to compute things. And so you can wonder, okay, if there are some constraints, what will be the best system? And I'm going to have a very simple approach here. I'm going to only use two simple constraints, which hopefully you'll find them credible. The first constraint is that if you think that it's a signal produced by your brain, well, I'm going to assume that there are boundaries that your brain can create. We have a limited number of neurons. We have a lot of neurons. can do a lot of things. But you can think that if your neurons, the neurons in charge of the reward signals in our brain are thought to be the dopaminergic neurons, if all of them were going to fire at high intensity, that would be a very strong signal of satisfaction. Or if all of them fire at very low level or become to look inactive, that would be a low signal of satisfaction. So the first constraint I'm going to consider is that there is a maximum level of satisfaction that you can experience and a minimum one. And the maximum one you can think of, you know, if the football team you support win the Champions League, you're ecstatic, or maybe your national team win the World Cup, or maybe the person you're in love with says that she or he wants to marry you. This is the kind of thing. There is a level which is, amazing, but that the brain cannot, there's not an infinite amount of satisfaction that the brain can, and so you reach a boundary. It's not a problem. If you have such a system, well, your system could be designed such as whatever the characteristic of the outcomes, and here in this example, which is a simplified examples for just exposition purposes here, I would assume that maybe a more ripe banana is better than a less ripe banana, then the system would kind of identify from the color, for instance, that this one has a higher value, a higher likely satisfaction that you would get from taking it. So you should pick this one. Okay, so you look at the two bananas and say, oh, this one looks better, I'll appreciate this more, and then you would pick this one. Okay? So the fact that you have this constraint is not in itself a problem. You'll still be able to make decisions, perfect decisions. But I'll just add another constraint, just one, is that your perception, this signal, cannot be perfectly precise. Okay? And that is credible. We know from neuroscience that neuronal activities are somewhat random. So if you perceive exactly the same thing, there will be some noise in the signals in your produced by your neurons. But noise then it is problematic, because if the signal is noisy and I represent it with this kind of range of values, so now when you see this yellow banana, instead of getting for sure this blue line, you may get some signal in the range which is represented by this band, this blue band. But then now if you have that, well, sometimes you see there's options which are worse, but they are close enough, and you will end up not being sure because the range overlap. Okay? And this is very intuitive. You go in a restaurant and you look at two meals and they're close, and you're like, I'm not sure, which one do I prefer? Okay? If they are very different, you're able to discriminate, so I'm pretty sure I'm going to prefer this one. But sometimes the characteristics are pretty close, and you'll be like, I'm not sure. You're indecisive. That would be this kind of situation. In a situation where you're when you're not sure, you may end up choosing randomly. But if you choose randomly, there is actually underlying, there is a better decision. In the same way, if I were to give you another example, if you take two pens, right, one of them may be heavier than the other one, if you were to put them on very precise scales, but your perceptual system may not be precise enough to discriminate. And so if I ask you, give me the heavier pen, you may choose randomly. Similarly here, you may choose randomly between the two options. Choosing randomly is bad because, half the time, maybe you're going to choose this one, well, actually choose this one. And they are maybe small, but remember that the system is here to help you make good decisions all the time. So the system wants to, a good system would be a system which minimizes the situations where you make mistakes like that. How can a system minimize this kind of mistakes? Well, there is a very simple solution. Because you have this uncertainty, this imprecise perception, the system can compensate by having a steeper slope between the options you're facing. So if now you have a steeper slope, you still have the same imprecision, but the ranges do not overlap anymore. Okay? So now you're just sharper, you're just better able at discriminating that this option is better, and instead of choosing randomly, you can identify this one. But what's the problem here? The problem is that I've said, okay, you can reduce the mistakes by increasing the slope, but because it's bounded, you cannot increase the slope everywhere. Okay, so where should the slope be steep and where should the slope not be steep? Should it be here? You could think of plenty of shapes where it's steep somewhere and not steep somewhere else. Well, when you solve it with formal models, about trying to find the best solution, the optimal solution, economists found that there is one solution, mathematical solution to this problem, is that it should be steeper in the range where you are more likely to face options, which is intuitive. Okay? If you regularly face decisions in a given range, then you should be able to very much discriminate in that range. And so it should be very steep here. There is a cost, though, that is not going to be very steep there. So if you're very well used to discriminate between pens, and I give you, I don't know, big things, which are much heavier, you may not have the same sensitivity. Okay? And similarly, another example is really how our eyes perceive luminosity. So we are in this room, there is some level of luminosity, and our eye is going to be able to discriminate between different contrasts in this kind of range. Okay? So our visual neurons, and that's results from neuroscience, will be like just steeper in the range of luminosity which characterizes this room. If we were to turn off the light, then everything would become dark. We would not be able to see anything. Why? Because then our visual neurons were able to detect this kind of level, but then suddenly the luminosity would be much lower in the range here. So everything would look the same. But then there would be a phase of adaptation, and progressively our neurons would recalibrate to adapt to the new level of luminosity, which is lower, and then initially everything is dark, and then suddenly we start perceiving shades of gray, and we're able again to discriminate different contrasts. Okay. So this system, this is a formal results which come from economics, but it's also perfectly compatible with the research currently in neuroscience. And if you have that, well, you recover key aspects from prospect theory, from why you have from Kahneman and Tversky, why you have an S shape of satisfaction. Okay. It also answers where is the reference point. The reference point should be the level of expectation. If you have this kind of curve, it should be where you're more likely to face decisions. Okay. I'm going to go one step further and ask another question. Okay, if you have this kind of satisfaction system where you have a utility which depends on a reference point, there may be another problem which can arise. What if we have a bit of freedom, a bit of leeway in interpreting, where is this distribution? So because this distribution, it's not trivial, it's out there. Like if you think in terms of the options you're likely to face, this distribution is not given to you. You have to kind of find out what is this distribution. If you, for instance, like think about you finish your studies and you're going to go to try to find a job, and you wonder, if I get job offers, what is a good job offer? You may set your aspirations, say, oh, I would like to have this kind of job and this kind of income. And basically what you're doing is you're trying to think about this distribution, and that's going to shape your expectations, your aspirations, and you'll be happy if you're above these aspirations and unhappy if you're below. But you may have some freedom in deciding whether your expectations or aspirations should be high or low. And if you have, then there is a problem, because suppose you are this person and you think about the possible results you may face, and you wonder, given the information I have, is it that I'm this world where my perspectives are not great, so I face this distribution? Or is it that I face this world where the perspectives are okay, or this world where the perspectives are good? Well, if this person has some discretion, some ability to decide how to interpret the information, then why does this person follow some recommendation, like Lao Tzu, for instance, who said, be content with what you have. Rejoice in the way things are. When you realize there is nothing lacking, the whole world belongs to you. Which means, if instead of aiming super high, I'm just, thinking, well, what I have is good. If I don't need much more, then you can actually, the consequence that your utility function, the reference point, will be low. And intuitively, if you have low expectations or low aspirations, everything will look great. And this is spelled out here by this person. The scientific key to happiness is low expectations. If you set low expectations, you will be happy. Okay? So there may be a tension here, that is, if we have some leeway to interpret the information we have, whether we should have high or low expectations, we may have an incentive to set low expectations because things will be great. But from the point of view of this system, which is designed to help us make good decisions, then that's a problem. Because if I decide to set low expectations, I'm going to make mistakes. So for instance, you get your degree, you go on the job market, and you get offers, and you decided to follow Lao Tzu recommendation. Anything will make you happy. And then you get a very good job offer, and then it's great, and then you take it. But wait a minute, if you were actually, thinking that you're likely to get a very good job offer, and you get a very good job offer, maybe you ask, oh, it's a very good job offer, but could it be even better? Could I ask for something? Could I ask a bit more? Could I negotiate for, the hours or the starting time, etc.? And this question, can I get a bit more? You may not ask it if you think that everything is great. Okay, so having low expectations will not lead you to make the best decisions. So ideally, the optimal system would correct for that and prevent you from being pessimistic, from having low aspirations. How can a system do that? Well, there's two solutions. First solution, you can get happiness at the time when you're considering how to set your aspirations. Okay. If you receive good news and you wonder, what does it mean? If you decide to interpret a good news in a positive way, which means that you think it means that you have high expectations, you will feel good about it. Okay. And here you have a tension, which I think is intuitive, is that imagine somebody gives you an amazing news that you could get a dream job, or that somebody that you're in love with is also interested in you. You have these two tensions, that is, you think you would love to believe the story, because that would be a great situation. So you want to believe the story, but you also worry that if you believe the story, and if you set your expectations too high, you may be disappointed. Okay? And you will have to manage your expectations between these two tensions, the risk of being disappointed and the wish to believe in it. And basically, an optimal satisfaction system would manage this tension for you to set your expectations and your aspirations at the right level. First solution. But this solution is imperfect, because if you have this feeling, this good feeling of having high expectations or high aspirations, why not you sometime start having delusional aspirations? So I could just think, oh, maybe in 3 years I'll be as rich as Elon Musk, and maybe this will never happen, and I'm kind of aware it's never going to happen, so I'll be disappointed when it doesn't happen, but it feels just great. I just enjoy this feeling. So if you're rewarded for having these kind of optimistic expectations, there is a risk that it goes overboard. And what we can show, once again, this is formally shown, and I explain intuitively in the book, is that a subjective satisfaction system cannot solve these two problems of preventing you from being pessimistic and preventing you from being optimistic with a utility function or a curve which is symmetric, like the one, like this one. So when you have a symmetric curve like that, the system cannot solve these two problems. And what your system needs to do is to be asymmetric and to reward you more for having correct aspirations. So if you have the first distribution, your satisfaction should be higher when you actually decided to set your mind and your reference point at this level, and you should be on the black curve. And if you're here, if your expectations are here, you should once again feel better, relative to this symmetric curve. You should be on this higher curve that is having higher satisfactions from having the right expectations. That is, you think you're going to do it, and you do it, your satisfaction should be higher. Okay? And this helps your system of satisfactions to make sure that you are going to set your mind, you're going to set your expectations at the level, which is a level that is really the one your information tells you can do. And if you put a linear approximation around your expectations, what you get is pretty much a feature from the prospect theory from Kahneman and Tversky. So these features, which are characterized as imperfections, as biases, can be fully explained as actually the solution of a system of satisfaction which is designed to identify what you can do and then push you to reach it. Right, so now I'm going to go to the second part, which is another part of the book. So the first part of the book talks a lot about this kind of decision situations when you're alone, and the second part talks a lot about the social situations, which present another level of complexity where when you're interacting with others, you just don't have to be right, but you have to be anticipating how others behave, etc. And here the big topic that I'm going to talk to you about is reciprocity. Okay, so when you think about economics, you think typically You may think that economists think that people want money, they just care about money, etc. But the field gives us much more insights about how people behave and what they behave. And one of the key things that we are able to understand is why people behave so pro-socially, engage in reciprocal cooperative behavior. Okay? And that's not a mystery at all, I think. I mean, and lots of things that present are well known, but often not discussed enough. So there's good and less good aspects of reciprocity. As you know, as Barbara said, I'm in Brisbane, and these are 2011 floods in Brisbane, and these are people who of their own, accord, decide to help their neighbors saving their stuff. And there was a kind of a big move of spontaneous generosity from people to try to help their people in their community, in their neighborhood. And this is not cheap because this water is, full of sewage water. It's not the kind of, if you were able to avoid it, you would. So that's the positive aspect of reciprocity. Often people don't behave like the selfish, agent that economics often describe. But sometimes reciprocity is not always good, because sometimes, reciprocity is used in ways which we don't think is great, like when jobs are given to friends instead of, open to full competition. So it's not that reciprocity is always good. So can we understand these aspects, the good and the not as good aspect of reciprocity? Well, the way economists think about it is, if you have done a bit of game theory, you'll be very familiar with, is the prisoner's dilemma. So the prisoner's dilemma is a game to think about cooperation, why cooperation exists in the first place. And this is my favorite version of the prisoner's dilemma, where you have two people who are outlaws, so they cannot do an exchange openly with a contract, and one wants to sell some diamonds and one wants to buy diamonds. But because they cannot do a contract, they have to exchange suitcase somewhere, and very quickly, and they won't be able to check what's in the suitcase. So the problem here is that they would like, they say they would like to cooperate, and they prefer to be in the situation when the suitcase exchange happens. But each of them could decide not to bring the suitcase, and the seller, for instance, instead of bringing diamonds here, the diamonds, instead of bringing the diamonds, the seller could bring nothing. Okay? And if you put stones or whatever at the same weight, the buyer would only realize afterwards. And when you look at the seller's decisions, whatever the other do, so if the buyer brings the money, the seller has an interest to bring nothing. If the buyer brings nothing, then the seller also has an interest to bring nothing. So whatever the buyer does, the seller has an interest actually to cheat. And it is symmetrical, so whatever the seller does, the buyer also has an interest to cheat and to bring nothing. And so when you look at that, even though they would both prefer to be cooperating and exchanging something, each of them has an incentive to cheat, and they will end up being in these situations where nothing happens, so they cannot exchange. And that's a dilemma, because if you were to ask them, they would prefer to switch from this box here to this box, but they are stuck into this situation. But that's often, and you do game theory 101, and that's often you can stop here. The discussion will be, so cooperation is difficult. But the key insights we got from economics, and it comes back from the 50s, is that this is only if you play once. What if the two people here decide that they want to play every week? Every Sunday morning, they'll do an exchange. Okay? It's a business operation. Well, you can imagine now that if one Sunday morning the seller doesn't bring the diamonds, and the buyer brings the money, so we're on this box, so the buyer cooperates, brings the money, but the seller doesn't bring anything, what's going to happen the next Sunday? Will the buyer come back the next Sunday and bring, again, money while the seller didn't bring anything? No. The deal is likely to break down, and people are likely to stop cooperating. And as a consequence, by cheating today, the seller may break a system of cooperation, which in the future may bring a lot of money. Okay? And this loss of cooperation in the future can actually act as an incentive to cooperate in the present. That's the key insights we got from game theory. And so cooperation is possible for that reason. And actually, the results from game theory is that cooperation is actually almost, if they are patient enough, they will be able to approximate full cooperation almost perfectly. Okay? So instead of the pessimistic view about the fact that the game, the prisoner's dilemma tells us that it's hard to cooperate, one another way to think is that, well, if you have repeated cooperation and if players are patient enough, most likely there will be cooperation. There can be a lot of cooperation. The next question is like, what kind of cooperation is going to look like? Well, that's what I just said. Well, you can think, you just have to have some specific type of strategy which will make sense to cooperate. One is a grim strategy, which is you and me, we play this game, and the rule is simple. We are just willing to cooperate, but we are very unforgiving. If you cheat with me once, I'm never going to forgive you. I'm going to stop doing anything with you. And you know that. Because you know that you don't have any interest to cheat on me. Similarly, I think you're doing the same, so I don't have any interest to cheat on you. And so even though we are like unforgiving, we are going to end up cooperating all the time. That's one possibility. Another possibility is tit for tat. You know, I do what you did. You cooperated last time, I cooperate now. You didn't cooperate last time, I punish you now. But if you come back and you cooperate again, then I can restart cooperating. And that also works. And so something very fascinating happened in the 80s when Axel Rod, a political scientist, asked social scientists and behavioral scientists and psychologists to say, okay, we want to know what is the best strategy to play repeated prisoner's dilemma? What is the best way of cooperating when you could have people cheating, etc.? And social scientists all over the place came up with very complex strategies. Some strategies using Bayesian calculations to try to understand what the other strategies are doing and trying to beat them, etc. What was striking is that outside of all these very complex strategies, the one which came on top was tit for tat. And here's the kind of accumulation of success of strategies when they play against each other. Tit for tat. Something that if you have young kids, 3 or 4, they'll start understanding this kind of stuff. How is it that we are asking a fundamental question about cooperation? How can we cooperate? And the strategy which ends up winning is such a simple strategy. Well, Axel Rod said, it has very nice features. That's also another puzzle. It is nice, it starts cooperating, and it continues to cooperate with cooperators. It is not a pushover. That is, if you don't cooperate, it retaliates against defectors. And it is forgiving. That is, it retaliates only once after a defection, and then if the other strategy starts cooperating again, it cooperates again. And the other aspect which is strange here, that we have a very simple strategy, but we can interpret it with these kind of intuitions, these moralistic intuitions about what this strategy is doing, as if it had some kind of psychological aspect into it. And maybe once we see that, we can actually take the problem in the other direction, that if we can make sense psychologically of this very simple rule, it's because our moral intuitions are determined as a solution to the problem of cooperation. That's why we find this rule intuitive, because our moral intuitions are, in the first place, something which help us deal with the problem of how to be successful in repeated cooperation, in repeated coordination. And something which is striking when you look at the culture all across the world is how rules of reciprocity are very emerging in just checking the time, yeah. Emerging in very different places independently. You can see in Buddhism, treat no others in ways that you yourself would find hurtful. In Christianity, we have, in everything, do to others as you would have them do to you, for this is the law of the prophets, etc. You find that in Confucianism, Hinduism, and Islam, etc. This is a golden rule which seems to have emerged independently across the world in different places. And so we tend to think that religion creates morality, but another possibility is that our moral intuitions exist to help us solve the problem of cooperation. They naturally emerge across human societies for that reasons, and then they give rise as a kind of higher structure to religious institutions. Okay, so we can gain from cooperation, but then there's another key insight that we can get is that how should we, now that we can gain from cooperation, how should we split the gains from cooperation? And here we can get a lot of insights also about how the real world works and why it works the way it works. Let's consider these two people, John and Jane, and let's consider situations where they are not symmetric. Because if they are symmetric, often there is a simple way of splitting the gains, it's 50-50. But there's plenty of situations where you have to split the gains from cooperation and there's no symmetry. Here in this example, John is junior, Jen is a senior, John's put a lot of hours, Jen's put a few hours. Here, John is not very knowledgeable and Jen is highly knowledgeable. And every day they work on projects and they build cooperation and they gains from it. And the question is, how should they split this pie? If you were in science, you could be writing papers, and the question is, how do you decide the order of authors on the paper and the credits that you give, etc.? Okay. Well, here's the insights came from Ken Binmore, game theorists who work on this kind of thing. And he said that norms of fairness, when we say, that's fair, that's unfair, what are norms of fairness? You can think of norms of fairness as a way to coordinate our beliefs and for us to agree on how to split these gains from corporations without having to fight and to haggle all the time. Okay? And so we have, in every society, we'll have norms of fairness, which tells us respect, older people, respect effort, or reward talent. And so when we are in a given situation, when you can see that you have these kind of differences between who has contributed what to a project, we have these intuitions about what's the kind of normal way of solving this problem. What is the kind of, and the fair way of solving this problem is the normal way. And because these norms are shared, I know that you share these norms, and similarly, you know that I share these norms, and you know that you share these norms, and so we don't have to talk about it often. It's kind of natural, the solution emerges, and we don't need to talk about it, we don't need to argue about it, and so we can continue. And these norms, typically, they're always here in the background to help us navigate these decisions. And when they appear is when they are violated. When do we talk about fairness? Is when people step outside of the norm, and then we say it's unfair. But most often we don't need to talk about them, even though they still guide all our decisions. These fairness norms enact in a fair way. It's not irrational. It's not that people are altruist and incur cost. They come with cost and benefits. If you follow fairness norms and you're known to be somebody who is fair, you get social rewards, you get a better reputation for doing so. And people want to work with you. They want you as a colleague. They want you as a partner. If, on the contrary, you don't follow social norms and fairness norms, and you get a reputation for being a bit cheating or not putting your fair share of work, then you get penalties like shunning, and people are less keen to include you in their projects and in their groups. So they're all self-enforcing. From an economic point of view, you can think of them as equilibria of social games. And then once you have this view, well, our moral preferences, once again, they're not a mystery. They are helpful to play the game of life. So we like people who are kind, people who are fair, and we enjoy being kind with them. That's positive reciprocity. We dislike people who are unkind and who are unfair. And we can even enjoy retribution and revenge. And if you think you don't, well, remember when you watch this American movie and the baddie get punished at the end and you feel that was, that's what you wanted, that's it. That taps into our psychology. Okay? And we spend a lot of time trying to navigate to find who is fair and who is unfair. A huge share of our social communication is gossip. It's like, did you know that John did that? No. Why did he do that? Well, I think it's a bit dodgy. This is very important for us to assess who can we trust, who can we work with. And all that explains how we navigate this social situation to gain from cooperation without losing out. Okay, this is to understand all the gains from cooperation. I'm going to just quickly to finish with the fact that, as I said initially, cooperation is not always positive. I mean, we like cooperation, and understandably, because there's plenty of gains from doing things together. But cooperation is not in itself necessarily good. And here, it's in this scene from The Godfather, we have an example of reciprocity. This person comes to see the Godfather because his daughter has been beaten up by some guys. And he asks for revenge. And Don Corleone tells him, well, I'm going to give you what you want, okay? But someday, and that day may never come, I'll call upon you to do a service for me. But until that day, accept this justice as a gift on my daughter's wedding day. Okay? It's you ask me this favor, I'm going to give it to you. I'm not asking anything special, but one day, if I'm in need, I expect you to come back. It's the language of reciprocity, but obviously it's in a setting which is a bit darker, because what he's saying is that he's going to beat up these guys, and he asks him another thing which is a bit unpleasant. And then when we have this, we can understand that reciprocity and cooperation can lead to cooperation, but also to conflict. So when you have circles of cooperations, the circles of cooperation can be in opposition. So you have, you have in your family, you cooperate within your family. In a kind of local area, in a city, you cooperate in the city. In the nation, you can cooperate in the nation. You can even enlarge the circle of cooperation and think about humanity. Some people, care about animal welfare, and they think that the circle of cooperation should be the environment. And you can have conflict between these different circles. So if, for instance, like you want to be more cooperative within the family and to give them jobs instead of following the rules in the country about how jobs should be attributed, that's nepotism. It's a conflict between two different spheres of cooperation. If you think that the sphere for you of cooperation is a nation, and you care about your nation, but you don't like the idea of cooperating with other nations, that's the basis of nationalism. It's a conflict between two spheres of cooperation. People who are nationalistic can be very pro-cooperation within their own group, defined narrowly, and against the larger group. And if you can also have the same conflict within a country. You could have a city or a region, or in the UK you could have, a nation who thinks that they want to, have cooperation more within a smaller area within the country than within the big country. So when you have the Scottish independence referendum, it's people who says, well, we would want, to have cooperation at the regional level, not within this stuff. So cooperation is not necessarily good and can explain a lot of the conflicts which can emerge in social life. And so that term is a broad presentation of the book, and the book covers pretty much all the topics in behavioral economics, and covers questions such as, why are we inconsistent in our choices? Why are we impatient? Why do we get angry? Why are people often unreasonable in conflicts, from workplace to work conflicts? Why are we overconfident? Why do we use varied language? Like we insinuate things instead of speaking clearly. And eventually I talk about what is rationality. So the book talks about all these, and each time I show that this kind of looks mysterious, but there are a lot of good reasons behind it, which we can understand. And so the message from the book is that we have learned a lot from behavioral economics, but the emphasis on irrationality is, I think, a mistake. That the strange ways we behave are often good solutions to the problem we face. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this enlightening presentation, and I like the quote from Corleone, El Padrino. So we now open the floor for questions. We will get the first questions from the audience here in person, and then I will get a help if there are questions from the large online audience. We had over 100 people, so we have a bit of an exodus, but let's also ask for the roving mics. The way we're going to do this is that you can signal. We will hand the roving mic to you. If you could please say your name and state as briefly as possible the question. Especially academics are very good in asking very long preamble questions. And I think, Lionel, you want one question per, you want to answer a question at a time?
One question at a time.
That's great. Yeah.
I'll stand up.
So we're going to start there. Thank you.
It seems like this relates to a kind of game theory, not the John Nash equilibrium sort of strict mathematical game theory, but more like a kind of practical social science geo-realpolitik of, in business and the MBA they call it cooperation and competition. Your allies become, they're allies on some things and they become adversaries on other things. There's a constant shifting of alliances in business and geopolitics. So you kind of have to consider both the cooperation and the competition. They're both very useful as long as it doesn't turn too destructive and deceptive.
Yeah, so it clearly relates to game theory and Nash equilibrium. So the book is written in a non-formal way, but behind what I presented, there's there's well-established formal theories which come from game theory, and the Folk theorem, follows the Nash equilibrium. There's this Nash, that when you cooperate a lot in repeated interactions, then there are plenty of ways, there are plenty of Nash equilibria that you could end up with different levels of cooperation.
Doesn't this relate quite a lot to the concepts of free riding and kind of public goods, effectively public services? And free riding is where you cooperate and then a large number of players figure out how to get sort of benefits without paying so much for them. So you talk about sort of public goods and public bads. This relates quite a lot to geopolitics.
Yeah. Well, I think that free riding, what you described, fits in it. And you were mentioning like cooperation and competition. My preferred description is given by Thomas Schelling, another very famous game theorist. He talked about mixed motive games. So you have like purely cooperation games and purely competition or purely coordination games when we really want to do the same thing. We say we have a meeting in London and we don't finish the emails, like where do we meet? So we have the same goals, to do the same thing, to meet together. Or we compete, we're in a war, we're completely opposed. And Thomas Schelling showed that most of the situations in the world are in between. They're mixed motives. Like, there's some aspect when we agree and we want to do the same stuff, and some aspect where we are in conflict. And here what you have is here, in repeated cooperations, in repeated games, you have the potential of gaining from cooperating, but there is also potentially some opportunities sometimes to defect, okay? And so to free ride. And so all the norms that we have and the games that we play allows us to navigate things, to try to gain from cooperation without being taken advantage of, etc., to handle this situation.
Isn't this really fundamental to humanity?
That's the
in the
third
last 10,000
question.
years about trying to have incentives and penalties for too much deception and gaming of systems. So there's always a lot of temptations and kind of shortcuts.
Yeah.
There's always a lot of potential big economic surplus to be made by subverting any ecosystem, and that will continue until such time as the other big actors get together in a sort of geopolitical way and find ways of sanctioning, reducing the subversive behavior. It's geopolitics. It's always going to be that way, isn't it?
Yeah, and that's Elinor Ostrom, who got the Nobel Prize in Economics a while back, worked exactly on this kind of thing.
In other words, governance really
We
depends
have
on that game theory.
more questions, but we can share contacts and continue this conversation. So we have a question here, and then over there. Lucia?
Thank you. My name is Lucia Reich. I'm from University of Cambridge, a behavioral economist. So that was fascinating. Thanks so much. I have not yet read the book, but I will. May I challenge you a little bit on something? So your frame was actually using poor Dick Thaler on irrationality. As far as I know, but maybe you can help me here and prove otherwise, he says, he cringes when he sees people use the word irrationality. He does not use it. So I'm not really sure whether he's the right person to cite here, because actually, I think one of so it's about bounded rationality, and he also acknowledges and shows that a lot of those biases heuristics simply make a lot of sense from evolutionary psychology, social psychology, economics, and so I hear this a lot also from my students, and I keep saying, this is not really about irrationality, and I think it might be, maybe you might mean a specific type of behavioral economics, because there's, of course, orthodox behavioral economics and heterodox behavioral economics. I would challenge the claim that behavioral economics in general assumes that people are irrational.
Thank you. So for Thaler, maybe I said it quickly, but I was careful, but I said, this is how Richard Thaler's Nobel Prize was described by Slate. So this was not a quote from Thaler, it's a presentation, which refers to not so much to what he says, and I know he doesn't, he's cautious about talking about irrationality, but how behavioral economics is perceived as being this discipline which, talk about irrationality. So I don't think we disagree on that. I think the lady at the back, she was waiting for a while.
Great, Lionel, you go for it. You pick.
Hi, my name is Mira, and I'd like to ask a question on decision making. What would you say the main thing is that makes people better at making like decisions and also like faster at making decisions? So what like makes different people like more likely to be like what is it specifically that makes people like better at making decisions?
That's a tough question. I mean, maybe I have some like, my first reaction would have to have a very boring answer. It's experience makes you better at making a good decision. You know, it's a boring answer, but if you read, there's another literature in behavioral science beside all the literature on biases, etc. The literature by Klein, who looks at how people make decisions in real life situations, and the point that is made in this literature is that experience matter. So when you take people in new, novel situations, they can look a bit naive or myopic, etc. But from experience, they can be very good at making quick decisions. So Klein has his studies about like firefighters and how they take very quickly some cues in situations and understand that this is a much more dangerous situation than it seems, and then you ask them, how did you know? And they kind of, oh, well, now that you say that, I noticed this thing and it just felt wrong, etc. And that's experience. So from this literature, for instance, what you learn is how do you improve people's decision making? You build their experience. What does the army do, for instance, to train people, given that they will face novel situations? They organize games, they organize repetitions, simulations, and you can do that in companies as well. And this is that way you confront your initial expectations to some real surprises, and that prepares you to face the real decisions eventually.
But would you also say that in people's natures, there's something that can make people more or less decisive, and it's not necessarily experience that like affects the way people make decisions?
So I'm not sure I get your last question.
It could be in people's nature to be more or less decisive, and it's not necessarily correlated with how much experience someone has had. Do you think that could be an option?
Yeah, I mean, there will be individual differences, right? So
would you say there's not one specific thing that can predict, like, or basically say how decisive or how well someone can make a decision?
Well, there could be some things which makes you more or less decisive, and there are models that I talk about in the book, but not here. But how long do you wait until you're confident enough to make a decision? And people could vary on that. So that would make people more or less decisive.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
So there are a few questions also from the center here. So can we have one? There's one at the back. You really raised the hand a lot, black shirt. And then we're going to move to the front, and then there. And we have 10 more minutes. So let's try and ask one question instead of following on from now on. I also have a question, but I'll keep it for later.
I'll try and be fast. My question is, how much do you think your education and your culture influences our way of collaborating, and how can we mitigate the effect of that?
It's related. It's related.
Yeah, I need to be careful that Michael is here, so I shouldn't be saying something. I think it does matter a lot, yeah. Education, culture does matter a lot. I mean, you can think that, we have this problem, the kind of problem of cooperation. There's this huge opportunity to build a big cake together. And game theory tells us that there's plenty of ways to coordinate and to find a way to do that. But there are also plenty of ways when you could fail, okay? And you can think that some societies, maybe for random reasons, just happen to stumble on very efficient ways of managing cooperation. And so you have some societies where you will have high levels of trust, a high level of cooperation, a high level of coordination, and these societies are going to thrive. And you have other societies for maybe also other historical reasons when they didn't stumble on a good equilibrium. And stumble on a situation when you have low level of trust, which means that you have low level of cooperation, etc. I don't remember the details, but I know of studies, anthropologic studies in Africa, when you have some specific communities when they have effectively very low level of cooperation, low level of trust. Now, in history, if you go back in times, and you had maybe lots of different communities, those communities would have happened to have, for some random reasons, managed to find a way to coordinate with nice norms, which leads them to be cooperative. They would just be more successful. They would, they would be able to coordinate to build an irrigation system, to build a wall against a village to protect against aggressions, maybe to build an army and, unfortunately, to attack other people. That would be more efficient. And so one way, the norms, in a way, like that, would be exported to other communities, or maybe others would start copying the stuff which works. So, it's not independent, but you can think definitely that cultural norms will matter to be able to cooperate. Yeah.
So I wanted to go back to the banana example. So your banana example assumes that the yellow banana is the right decision and the slightly greener banana is the wrong decision. But what you're saying on the chart, effectively, the y-axis, you've got subjective perception. And if the aim of the game is, subjective happiness, ultimately, that noise, you're saying, might lead you to make the wrong decision and choose the greener banana. But if you're still within your subjective perception, which is the same as potentially the yellow banana, doesn't that make the green banana also the right decision?
Excellent question. Okay, so you're asking a very nice question, which requires for me to go a bit deeper into what I've presented. Okay, so you could almost think, and that's the way we think about it, it's a bit abstract, but if you follow me, hopefully maybe I can give you, you can follow this problem as there are actually, you are one player in this game, trying to make good decisions, and evolution is another player. Evolution is a process of optimization. It's slow, it's learning, etc. And there's no religious, thing in that, but you could use a metaphor and say, well, evolution is a designer. And if evolution is a designer and try to design you to make good decisions, what evolution can do is give you a system of satisfaction. Okay, now, you, the organism, the only thing you can use to make decisions is use this system of satisfaction. So you only care about satisfaction. But evolution doesn't care about satisfaction. Evolution cares about fitness, your success. So yes, from your point of view, you don't care about the bananas, but evolution cares about whether you make the right decision. And she will design the system which eliminates the mistakes.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. I'm Jared, and my question is on the first part of your lecture. How have you defined and scoped satisfaction? Is it hedonistic in nature? And if yes, do social incentives derived from moral norms, like reciprocity as you covered, affect your theory of using subjective satisfaction to explain prospect theory?
So I just missed one or two words at the start of your, about the subjective satisfaction. Can you just repeat?
Have you defined it in a hedonistic way?
Oh, yeah. So subjective satisfaction in this perspective is a signal produced by your brain to tell you what's better, what's worse solution. And I give you an example of bananas, but it covers everything. When you look at social interactions, also it would tell you what kind of social situation is better. Why do we care about having high status? High status is great for success. So you get promoted, or people tell you do a performance of violin, and people tell you're a great violin performer. You feel good about that. Your status increase. On the contrary, if I was to stumble of the stuff, I would feel shame, and that because, losing status is bad, relatively, So all our social feelings also associated with satisfaction because they're associated with different degrees of success. And we should be very perceptive and caring a lot about these things. So it's not just, choosing between bananas, it's about everything which matters.
There's a question there.
Hey, I'm Raphael. I'm doing the EME program here at LSE. Great talk, thank you. So earlier you showed how one of the rational equilibria in the infinitely repeated prisoner's dilemma game is the grim trigger strategy for everybody. And this has been used to kind of explain the sustenance of cartels in pricing competitions, right?
Yeah.
But what we actually see in real life sometimes is that they'll maintain this cartel for a period of time, and then somebody will, play the Bertrand, optimal strategy, drop the price and then undercut everybody else, and then everyone else will undercut or will drop their prices for a period of time until they kind of renegotiate, reestablish the cartel. So how do you, could you work a behavioral economics angle into this deviation from rational behavior?
Sure, so that's not the definition of rational behavior. And actually, it's funny that you say that because I've got a blog, a Substack. I wrote exactly something about that, about how petrol prices often have these cycles, exactly what you described. And you can explain it with game theory. Is that the model is just a bit more complex than the repeated prisoner's dilemma with perfect observation. So here you have perfect observation, I know exactly what you do. But in the real world, it's a bit more complex. Often you don't have perfect information. And also, to have this kind of stuff, you have to consider larger cartels. So I don't think this happened in the UK, but if you were to be in Australia like me, you'd have like this very strange thing where the petrol prices do this kind of every 3 weeks in Brisbane, this cycle. They shoot up by 30 cents, and then they decrease slowly, like you described, like people cutting prices slowly, and then they eventually shoot up again. And that's not related with international prices. So what happens here is that you have a market, and you can explain it by game theory, when you have one big actor, and you have lots of small actors. And the solution of this game is that they want to coordinate, but they can't officially coordinate because it's illegal. But they can use some signals to wink at each other, to coordinate, without talking to each other. And when you look at the precise data, they have colleagues who do this amazing job. They unpack all the data, and they can see that the market, the big actor in the market, is going to raise the price precisely in 2 or 3 stations the day before, and everybody sees that and says, okay, that's a signal. We're going to raise by that much everywhere tomorrow. They do that. They raise the cooperative points, and then the small actors have they are often more price sensitive. They have an interest to cut down progressively. So this whole logic is not irrational, and it's a perfect example of you see something strange, and you could say, oh, people are strange, you know, the world is strange, but there's meaning behind it. You can.
Thank you.
There are many questions. But it's almost 7:45, so I think it's the optimally rational point to stop before we get too hungry or too tired, too hot, or too cold. It's been a great pleasure to listen to you and to talk about the book. If you want to know more about the book, absolutely get the book. I have that version. This is a hardcover. It's really well written, besides being engaging. And if you want to know more about behavioral research that is contained in the book around this topic, here at the LSE we do behavioral research across lots of departments. And for instance, here's a little cheeky marketing of a behavioral lab for research and teaching. We will have more announcements in the coming weeks because we have a new website. But with that, I want to thank you, Lionel, for a very engaging talk. Thank you so much for coming to speak to us, and thank you all for joining us this evening. Here and online, we had many people. Thank you so much, and have a good evening.